In the early morning hours of September 30th, 1919, in the small town of Elaine, Arkansas, a brutal conflict erupted that would leave a lasting scar on the history of racial violence in the United States. The events that transpired during what became known as the Elaine Massacre would change the lives of countless black families, expose the depth of racial hatred in the American South, and contribute to the long history of racial injustice that continues to resonate today. Elaine, a small farming community in the Arkansas Delta, was a place where the racial divide between black and white residents was especially stark. In the years following the end of the Civil War and the brief moment of Reconstruction, black farmers were often caught between struggling to survive under a system that kept them subjugated and their desire for more freedom and equality. Many black sharecroppers in Elaine and surrounding areas had been dealing with poor working conditions, debt, and exploitation by white landowners and merchants. They had little to no rights and were often at the mercy of the white establishment that controlled nearly every aspect of life in the region. In 1919, a new organization was emerging to challenge the status quo, the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. The union was founded with the goal of organizing black sharecroppers to demand better wages, better working conditions, and the right to negotiate contracts with white landowners. The union began to grow rapidly, and so did the tensions. Many white landowners saw the union's success as a direct threat to their dominance. What started as peaceful discussions over wages and working conditions quickly escalated into violence. On the evening of September 30th, 1919, the situation took a dangerous turn. A group of black farmers met at a church in Hoop Spur, a rural area near Elaine, to discuss their rights and how they could resist the abusive practices of white landowners. Word of the meeting spread, and a group of white men, many of whom were armed, decided to confront the group. An altercation broke out, and a white deputy sheriff was shot and wounded. This single incident would set off a chain reaction of violence, triggering what would later be called the Elaine Massacre. Within hours, local and state authorities began to react. Hundreds of armed white men, including law enforcement, state militia, and vigilantes, descended on Elaine, and in the ensuing days, they began to round up black residents. The violence that followed would leave an unknown number of black men, women, and children dead. Estimates vary, but most historians agree that at least 100 black people were killed, though some figures suggest the number could be higher. Many black residents fled the area in fear of their lives, while others were detained in makeshift prisons. Entire communities were devastated as homes were destroyed and families were displaced, their livelihoods wiped away. Despite the brutality of the massacre, very few white people were held accountable. In fact, the only people who were truly punished were black men, many of whom were charged with crimes they didn't commit. Over 100 black men were arrested, and 12 were convicted of murder, despite a complete lack of evidence. The trials were a mockery of justice. The men were denied legal representation, forced to confess under duress, and sentenced to long prison terms, some to death. However, some of these convictions were later overturned, though the damage was already done. The Elaine Massacre did not just fade into the annals of history. In the years that followed, the massacre became a symbol of the deep racial injustices that black Americans faced in the South. It also helped to bring attention to the growing civil rights movement that would gain momentum in the decades to come. Though the massacre occurred before the rise of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., it nonetheless helped to lay the groundwork for the civil rights struggles that would follow. The pain and trauma of Elaine fueled the demand for change. In the years since the massacre, historians, scholars, and activists have worked to bring attention to what happened in Elaine. Today, a small memorial stands in Elaine, a reminder of the lives lost and the injustices suffered. But the Elaine Massacre remains a stark reminder of the racial tensions that have shaped much of American history. It serves as a call to never forget the horrors of the past, so that we might work toward a more just and equitable future.